In Building the Black City, The Transformation of American Life, historian Joe William Trotter explains that African Americans built and rebuilt urban communities to serve their own needs in the face of assaults on their civil and human rights. And Milwaukee is one of the more than 20 cities that the book covers, and we're joined now by Professor Trotter, the director and founder of Carnegie Mellon University's Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy. Thanks for joining us again on Black Nouveau, Professor Trotter.
Thank you for inviting me.
What makes a city a black city?
You know, that is one of the issues that I take up in the book, because I know that in thinking about the book early on in the process, people wanted to know how I was defining the black city. And as it turns out, my definition of the black city is pretty broad and sweeping. There are some scholars who emphasize the idea of power as a way to think about the extent to which Black people exercise power over their environment. But in my view, that is one dimension of a city. But in African American life, we didn't wield the kind of sweeping power over these various cities. But we did manage to gain some influence over the section of the city that we occupied. And so I argue that we need to really broaden our notion of the city to include the ways in which African Americans constructed an infrastructure of their own within the city itself, within their own neighborhoods. And so that the Black city is really focused on ways in which African Americans occupied space and then transformed that space into an area that included an infrastructure of churches, fraternal orders, businesses, and political movements. So the definition that I use is pretty broad, and it encompasses a variety of elements.
Well, you talk about those different kinds of organizations, but before we get to that, in mapping black cities, you break the United States into 4 districts. The South, which you partition off into 2 groups, the Deep South and the Upper South, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. Can you briefly explain the groups and their differences?
Yes, this book is meant to be a very broad, long durée study, so to speak. I start with the colonial era and the transatlantic slave trade. And one reason for me starting early in the colonial period is because I think there is a misconception about the importance of Black life in cities from the beginning of the nation's history, rather than focusing only on the Great Migration when massive numbers of Black people moved into cities, which has really created a kind of bias in the thinking about Black urban life. There is a tendency to think that Black urban life is grounded much more in the 20th century transformation that took place with the Great Migration, when Black people moved to cities and sort of transformed the Black community from a predominantly rural environment into a predominantly urban environment.
Okay,
And
but
so,
I'm sorry, go on.
for me, I had to I felt obligated to ground the beginning of the Black urban experience in that earlier city where Black people were enslaved initially, and then gradually, before the Civil War, created a community that transcended enslavement and started to really reflect the way in which free Blacks started to build institutions, and in many ways in collaboration with their enslaved counterparts.
You know, you pack an awful lot of history into a book that's about 200 pages long. Talk
Okay.
about those institutions and the importance of them in building black cities, whether they're urban or rural.
Yes, the institutional infrastructure that they built was critical. Um, and the way I talk about those institutions is to, first of all, show how African Americans initially occupied land in sort of scattered, um, widely dispersed areas. And once they were able to sort of occupy land and gain some access to urban living, home ownership, rental property, and so on, they almost immediately started to come together to produce institutions that would serve their needs. And one of the earliest institutional manifestation of the city building process were the burial grounds across the country. African Americans in these early cities came together and insisted that they needed access to their own burial ground. And from those burial grounds and societies, you begin to see them branching out, building churches, building fraternal orders, and also building entrepreneurial enterprises to serve their needs. And
Okay.
that happened early on and intensified over time.
Okay, we've got a short period of time. One of the things that I was impressed with was the way you handled violence, because that's one thing that we don't really get in history is the amount of violence that was perpetrated on Black communities, rural and urban. And you
Yes.
do that in the book, and I think it's important because everybody knows about Tulsa, but there's so many places we don't know about.
Exactly. Urban violence, violence against African people, and efforts to really undercut their capacity to occupy cities is a major theme across regions. And so that's one of the things that really we can talk about distinctions, regional differences, between the Deep South urbanization, Upper South urbanization, Midwestern, Northeastern, and even what I call on the edges of the Deep South, and that's where Tulsa comes in, and Houston, and Miami. Um, Wherever we see African Americans building these cities, they're building these cities against the grain of a lot of hostility, a lot of overt violence and attacks on their property and their person. And so we do see that as a major sort of uh, cross-cutting theme that brings African Americans together and makes those communities look similar across these regional divides.
And that's sort of why your book at the end suggests that reparations is the only way to make this country better and a safer place for African Americans.
I do make the argument that reparations is the case for reparations I make. But this book is really a follow-up book to an earlier book I wrote called Workers on Arrival. In that book, I really emphasized the way that the case for reparations rested on the way Black people were deprived of the fruits of their labor, deprived of their land rights. And so there was a material dimension to that, an exploitation, economic dimension to that. But in this book, I'm arguing that we need to factor in the creativity that Black people also exhibited in the face of all these ways in which their labor was exploited. And so in a way, I'm making the argument that Black people then double tax their labor to build something for themselves. And so that the case for reparations should be both the deprivation of African American land and labor, but also the way that Black people recoup some of their energy to build their own city, which really means that they really should be compensated in a way that is really that acknowledge the way that they made a way out of no way, despite the exploitation.
Thank you very much for joining us, sir, and thanks for the book.
Thank you. Appreciate it.